Now, businesses are bracing for the EFF's national shutdown tomorrow. Meanwhile, government's security cluster has stated that there will be no national shutdown and that its forces are prepared. Economic activities expected to be disrupted as the Red Berets take to the streets. Let's bring in now Professor Jacob Mofokeng, a public safety expert from the Tshwane University of Technology, for more on this. Good evening, Professor. Thank you so much for joining us. As we anticipate the national shutdown tomorrow, what sort of measures and where does one even start in readying yourself from a public safety perspective to make sure that the public is indeed taken care of and are safe? Where does one start in preparing for such an issue?
Good evening, Abigail, and to your viewers. It is very much important that the South African Police Service, together with the security agency, crime intelligence, take due diligence in terms of protecting those who will be marching tomorrow, as well as the members of the public, so that the march tomorrow should really end peacefully without damage to property as well as a loss of life. What is important concerning tomorrow, it is that this particular occurrence is different from that happened in July 2021. Whereas what we saw in 2021, it was a less preparation by the South African Police Service, lesser boots on the street, as well as a lack of coordination. But for this one, we see a lot of assurance by the minister, the national commissioner, as well as the commitment made by the president that there will be 3,000 South African members, South African defense members on the standby. So what is also important is for the public really to look after themselves, not those that are not marching really. Sometimes when people are on the standby, they end up being, in case there will be an incident, it will end up being in a loss of life. But there is much confidence in terms of the preparation that has been set in place. So we are looking forward tomorrow to see, indeed, because you remember there's been a lot of criticism regarding South African Police Service preparation towards incidents of this particular magnitude. So tomorrow is the test of their capabilities as well as coordination in consideration with other law enforcement agencies.
Professor, a point that you've touched on briefly is that the president has now deployed over 3,000 soldiers to assist the South African Police Service. How should we view this move? Do we see it as the South African Police Service not being prepared enough for what might transpire tomorrow, or do we see this as the president just being extra cautious?
Well, it is for the president to be extra cautious. There's been a criticism that the president is not really paying attention to security cluster, considering what happened post or during July 2021. So the capacity of the South African Police Service is, yes, it is always, bringing an element of doubt. Whether are they really capacitated in terms of how are they supposed to manage crowds in respect to controlling crowds, as well as the, during a particular event, what is it that is in place in terms of the intelligence? And we are aware that there are reports that, some people are being intimidated, that they should not go to work tomorrow, or maybe businesses should be closed down, because at the end of the day, perhaps then those that are in support of EFF, they need to be seen to be successful in terms of discouraging many people to be on the streets. So the army will just be on the standby. They will not really be on the street unless if then there will be reports of disruptions of violence. That's where now that process then will be activated for them to be released to be able to maintain that public order. But the use of the army or this particular branch of security, it is always also faced with criticism that they are not really supposed to be on the street and be seen on, in locations or, whenever there are incidents such as this, because their mandate is different from that of the South African Police Service. So currently, we are aware that South African Police Service that do not really have that much capacity to handle, crowds of this particular magnitude. So we also are aware that those that are police constables that are still in training, they've been recalled so that they can be on the street. Members that were supposed to be on leave, they are also, called to be, a force multiplier to be on the street. So it is the attempt by the South African Police Service to bring assurance to the business community as well as general public to say that they are capable to be able to ensure that tomorrow it will end without a loss of property or as well as that of lives.
And there's always seems to be mixed feelings when it comes to soldiers and the South African National Defence Force being deployed, because there is the issue of excessive force being used when trying to handle the situations. How do we ensure that, people obviously have the right to protest and people also have the right not to protest and to continue with their business as usual? But when it comes to the soldiers that have been deployed and bringing the South African National Defence Force or the Army in, how do we ensure that past instances do not reoccur and we don't see instances where excessive force is being used on South Africans?
Well, it's supposed to be both medium as well as a long-term strategy, in a case where you need to make use of the army, during incidents of this particular nature, because by their nature, they are not really supposed to be where they, to be seen moving around with, heavy weapons and kinds of clothing they'll be wearing, because that also can trigger, certain emotions from the members of the public, and we know that whenever there are protests or there are marches, it is not only people that are having good intentions, to make their voice heard, but also criminals. And the incidents of this particular nature will need the army to be trained in terms of how then are they supposed to, respond in a case where they are being deployed to, in a case of tomorrow. So the issue of training for the army, it is something that is very much important, because as you indicated, there are those reports of intimidation as well as the excessive use of force, and those that are critiquing this particular deployment will always argue that why do you bring the army, because they are not supposed to be where they they are deployed. So it is something that the NATRONs need to consider for long term, as well as particular incidents of this particular nature in the future. Then how do you manage? Because also the issue of state security agency, it has also been criticized that it has not really lived up to its own reputation. And then there's the use of intelligence, crime intelligence, where it happened in the past where there was no coordination of information. So what is going to happen tomorrow is to indicate whether are we really ready for, marches of this particular nature in the future. So, and also in the case where the army is going to be deployed and we see them, then also we cannot listen and maybe get reports whether there were cases of abuse or excessive use of force by the army. But it is about training. It's about demilitarization of the army, in a case where they have been deployed, in the case of tomorrow in March.
And then just lastly, Professor, we do know that, of course, security services can be deployed across the country, but police services and the soldiers that have been deployed cannot be everywhere at all times. In the past, we have seen instances of looting. What sort of measures can South Africans who own businesses or who are going to be continuing with business as usual tomorrow put in place to ensure that they are safe? What sort of things can they do to ensure their safety?
Well, when we look at intelligence, it's something that is very much important, that the control rooms or call centers, they are really in operations. We are aware that there are 11 helicopters that are, earmarked to police the march of tomorrow. What is important is, best practices. We have seen now videos doing the rounds of how certain businesses have taken precautions of removing, the vehicles from, their garages, so that in case where the police are unable to handle, this protest or the march tomorrow, at least they've taken that particular precautionary measures. So it is also important that members of the public, should take precautionary measures. It is not really, everyone has got the right to march because it is the exercise of their constitutional right, but businesses, wherever they detect that they might be under attack, it's for those few hours, it will be wise if they can close their shops. We are aware that indeed South Africa has lost quite a substantial amount in terms of GDP because of various factors, load shedding being part of that. And then business sector is, as much as it's against this particular, shutdown and the threat of, of intimidation, I think it is important that they need to use discretion in a case where they realize that their businesses or infrastructure might be under attack. And closing for a few hours until maybe the more forces are deployed in that particular hotspots, it will be wise and commendable rather than to open and eventually suffer a particular loss. So whenever there is maybe sporadic incidents of violence, it is always, advisable for members to move away from that. I know that we are attracted by, a particular commotion, but it will eventually end up in the loss of life. So I think that discretion, use of common sense, it will really be helpful for tomorrow.
Indeed, Professor, thank you very much for your time and your insights. We appreciate you talking to us. That was Professor Jacob Mofokeng. He is the public safety expert, just chatting to us about safety measures and precautions implemented ahead of tomorrow's national shutdown.